Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy this curious story that falls into that indistinct territory somewhere between the curious and the frightening. Also, we all have to start somewhere, and the support of appreciative souls like you will always take us further as we learn our skills from sentence to sentence. I would really value having your support, by you subscribing and then hitting the notification bell, so you can know when the next part is published. And let me know where you are. Write it in the comments below. Anyway, I thank you for your attention. And if you wish to learn where the two main characters come from and what the story is all about, then why not go back to the very beginning? You're back? Right. Let's get on with it. Chapter 10. The Traveler. The second observer spoke. I believe that his many injuries cause him grave concern. His colleague shrugged impatiently. Again you speak loosely, he said. Many have underestimated him. And they are all dead. Very, very dead. Be advised. After a moment's pause, the second one spoke again. I might just go out for a little walk. You do that. You do that. CERN didn't turn up. And neither did NASA. I was slightly disappointed because I fancied seeing what NASA people looked like. Whether they were as shiny as I hoped they were? However, the police forensics team returned. Why? I don't know. If you were to ask them, I doubt that even they'd been able to tell you. The team of 4 arrived full of zest, vigor and enthusiasm. Even bringing along a pot of coffee from Tom and the armed response team for drinking all mine. By lunchtime, I had the distinct impression that their zest, vigor and enthusiasm were crumbling, and they seemed to be floundering for purpose. The next day was much the same. Except they gave up earlier. It was puzzling. I didn't have a clue why they'd returned. And it seemed that neither did they. After drinking all the spare coffee they'd brought from the armed response team, there was little point returning. I didn't think it had anything to do with the coffee. It probably had everything to do with Shadow. He just sat and watched them from his second favorite spot in the world the entire time they were here. But when they left for the day, he was quickly back on the sofa, and as usual he didn't seem inclined to explain what was going on. And to be honest, I didn't really care, because I'd spent all the time in the garden saving plants and identifying stones I'd used before. I discovered that I had a weird memory. I could remember tactile things better than names and birthdays. I could place about 60% of the stones I picked up in their original places on the walls. Therefore, I made satisfying quick progress in creating piles of the stones more or less where they had been before the feline-inspired Armageddon. That evening, after the forensic scientists departed, I'd gone for a walk around my personal little Tunguska, and I felt pretty depressed. I kept a keen eye out for the suspended small holes I'd seen near the cottage after the cats had dealt with that first nothing. There were no diminished nothings about the place. Perhaps they'd all gone to the happy home for nothings. The county council chamber maybe? What I did see was the neighboring farmer trying to steal one of the trees that had happened to knock down his crappy fence. It was a crappy fence made up of I don't know what, chicken wire, stuff stolen from the council, or some other farmer in the dead of night. I'd been told that that's what his grandfather had been doing during the war. The damage was minimal, but that didn't stop him from insisting that he would sue me for substantial damages. I asked him if he was going to buy any soap with his winnings. He sneered, hawked and spat. It gives you an enormous amount of information about a person and his social group does that. I told him he was disgusting and he told me I was a bloody softie. I asked him to let me know when he'd put in a claim against me, because I wanted a good laugh listening to how he would get around act of God. I could have tuned out and left him there with a crushed fence, but I chose not to. Instead, I made it clear to him that I was offering the substantial sycamore that had fallen onto his fence as an act of good faith to make him F off. I advised him that if he tried anything shifty, as was his nature, he'd have to deal with me face to face or, worse still, the cat. The reference to Shadow made him take a step back. I've heard about your cat, he said, and checked over my shoulder to confirm the absence of a cat. What have you heard about my cat? Strange things happen when he's around. I nodded. I couldn't dispute the accuracy of local observations. One tree, I said, and pointed at the one I meant. Any cow or sheep that wanders onto my land, I'll accept it as an unsolicited gift, and I'll feed it to the cat. I wasn't joking. I spent another 15 minutes or so wandering about my private Tunguska, trying to find a spot where I might be able to build a greenhouse. At least there was one spot that looked perfect. However, I was worried that it might be exposed to the wind. But it might do. Then all I needed was any kind of greenhouse that could last a few months. I'd have to find a star to wish upon, or get a sub from the cat. It soon became quite clear that, however defined by experts, the matter was going nowhere. It had either been brushed under the carpet or even forgotten in some quarters. On the positive side, the garden was beginning to take on a post-apocalyptic shape, a new shape at that. The only zombie in that landscape was usually me in the morning before my coffee. I still hadn't started rebuilding the raised beds, but everything was in place, and all the plants saved had a temporary home in pots. I knew I could depend on the will and determination of plants to survive and reproduce to save most of them. I only had to place them in nutritious compost and leave them watered and sheltered. The old fridge freezer was back upright and there had been some losses of fragile little plants. It was strange what had been destroyed and what had been left undamaged. Plant spots or walls could be next to each other and yet suffer different fates. But I think the greatest surprise was that the cottage itself had come through what must have been, seemed, felt like. I couldn't even imagine it, because I was shamefully pissed out of my skull at the time. Still, it was strange with the experts arriving and the experts leaving, and it wasn't just them drinking all my coffee. There was something dancing enticingly in a very short mini skirt at the periphery of conscious thought, and waiting to draw my attention, but it kept drifting away when I tried to attend to it, skirt, bloomers and all. I couldn't get hold of something to shape into what Freud called an object to investigate. I let the damn thing slide away. Why not? It was all beyond me, and idiotic or not, insane or not, I still had faith, probably misguided, that a cat would look after me. I decided not to say that aloud because it sounded nuts. It was a strange relationship we had. Shadow seemed to know what he was doing, and I didn't have a bloody clue. After all the humans left, he stayed on the sofa for almost a week. There had been no sign of the other amigos since I last saw them, so it was just Shadow and me again. Me in the garden and him on the sofa. If he went out at all, then it wasn't through the front door or when I was watching. It would have been through the wall as usual while I slept. He didn't eat much but drank as much milk as he could, when I wasn't around. If there was an agenda for this low profile, I couldn't see it. All I could see was a cause for concern that this fearless and previously invulnerable little giant killer was far too quiet. It had been my intention to remove the picnic table, but just like the sofa, it was no longer mine. I sat on it reflecting on how much my life had changed recently. It should be noted that none of it was minor. The nothings that could easily have destroyed me and everyone hereabouts only happened after he turned up. His arrival was central to everything and consequently, the world had become a precarious place. Shadow must have been aware that I was thinking like this. If being here just for a bit of rest and recuperation jeopardized our welfare, he had to be aware of it. So why was he allowing all of us to be in danger? And then again, push aside all the above, fanciful speculation at best, he was still my little mate. I really did care about him, even though there was very little reciprocation apart from the odd sarcastic look. I had to do something, because as the days passed he seemed to be falling into a deeper sleep. The milk had been drunk and the food eaten eventually, but all I saw of him was a soft sleeping furry blob on the sofa. Maybe multiple division of self to fight holes in the ethers does take its toll after all. So, I decided to take him to the vet. And just like the Martians, I drew my plans and made an appointment, which was going to be fun. I forgot my growing suspicion that he was telepathic. When I picked him up intending to put him in a kitty traveling box basket, I was reminded how easily he could make me bleed. He dug deep into my forearms and dragged his claws through the flesh. I made reference to my doubts about his parentage, and for my cheek I received another vicious swipe that would have looked even more frightening in slow motion. I dropped him and hurried to the Belfast sink and thought I might need stitches. I might need a tetanus jab. Instead of all that self-indulgence, I decided not to be a wuss about it. Shadow must have known what he was doing, and I just had to trust the cat's cure. I wondered if the other two of him were suffering equally. Scratch that cruel thought. Shadow wanted none of my assistance, and I imagined that it would have been the same with the other two. I cancelled the vet, saying that what had seemed like an emergency was no longer an emergency. The receptionist threatened to bill me for the lost money-making opportunity. And I told her that I really wasn't worth the bother because I was too broke to pay. I suggested 50p a week for the next 90 weeks. Bless her. She listened to my story about Shadow savaging me, and suggested I leave him alone, especially as he wasn't in a very good mood. I learned from her that cats seem to be able to heal themselves if left alone. If Shadow was eating and drinking, then he had to be alright. I thanked her and went and poured TCP over my arm. Shadow must have been deep in Betty Bobo's land because he didn't move when I screamed. By the end of the week, the garden was as good as it was going to get. So much for a glorious departing. I'd wait a couple more days before I started planting the countless saved potted plants. The potatoes were a total loss. But that's the good thing about spuds, you can plant them all year round. They might not be ready for mid-July, but would be a bonus ready sometime in October. Nature is kind and generous if you show respect for her intelligence. I no longer needed to worry about the big fat flies, because without the sap from the sycamore leaves, they'd all bugger off. Also, plants had started growing in the war zone within the week. Nature hates vacuums of any sort, just like Shadow, and will fill them quickly. I'd obviously worried needlessly that for some highly technical reason nothing would grow there again. It gave me something else to think about in the evenings, about how I might develop it. And it kept bringing me back to my unrequited fantasy of owning a greenhouse. I was also forced to do something about the collapsed trees, because the poor farmer was still trying to tow trees onto his land with his brand new tractor and its old registration plate. Apparently, he told me, he was doing me a favor. I told him I had just slipped over the boundary from nice and would set the cat on him if I saw him again. He laughed at me, nervously I noted. While he buggered off across his field towards Hygiene Central, I called someone called Cledwin. I'm making it sound like I had plenty of friends. I hadn't. Willie no mates with distinction is what I am. Or extinction, if the cat keeps hanging around. Cledwin was a harvester who had been making decent pocket money over many years hunting for fallen trees after big storms. It was always the same deal he offered people. He'd reduce your fallen tree to logs and take half in payment. It was a good deal, but you had to keep an eye on Cledwin, because his idea of half was fluid. He would salivate at the number of trees I had down. Cledwin would be round as soon as he could, and wanted to know if he could drive his pickup onto site. It would be touch and go, so I lied and said yes. He's greedy, so I was confident he'd find a way. Next, to brief the cat. I was sure Shadow would understand. The next morning, after the previous day's depressed mood, the garden looked as if it just might be a pretty place in a few weeks, even though it looked as if its confidence had been shaken severely. Shadow was still on his sofa, and continued to cause me concern, because his face looked pinched with pain. Despite what he was eating, he looked decidedly thinner. From a safe distance, I asked him whether he wanted to go to the vet. With Shadow, a refusal was always emphatic, as my bloodied arm still showed. I checked the bowl of food, about half had been eaten. I took it as a good sign and filled another bowl with some kitty cocaine and topped up his milk. He was damaged but eating and drinking reasonably healthily, even if I never saw him do it. I tidied around the place while waiting for Cledwin to arrive, and replanted everything that looked up to the challenge. Optimism must have been a delusion because beneath the current momentum everything still felt rather precarious. There were so many things, nothing voids, events beyond the normal and the rational that seemed intent on destroying my little garden. Monsters of the universe are probably all alike, and prefer to think in terms of global domination, the macro as it were, rather than the micro in which my garden existed. I'm sure no alleged alien spaceship coming into land cared much about flattening anyone's Rudbeckia and Dahlia beds. We come in peace and, oh, and sorry about your petunias. I was performing a standing in the door appreciation of my little garden and keeping an ear pricked for Cledwin. With the garden as tidy as it was going to be under the circumstances, miraculously so, and the tree matter to be resolved by Cledwin, I found myself with the wrong sort of boredom. There were far too many things in my immediate environment to depress me. Even poor little Shadow, I'm ashamed to say. I had just about had enough and had to get away for a while. Jenny had asked me to go across to her new home for a bit of guard duty while she was away for a few days. I told her I'd do my best to pop around. While she was on the line, I asked about the old man and whether he'd reappeared. Jenny told me she hadn't seen him, although she hoped she would. I was glad to hear that, because it meant that there was no current threat against the house, Jenny's home. I had Shadow to protect me, and Jenny had Mr. Warburton. Lives in parallel. Apparently, her garden was coming on nicely, and she told me that the furthermost outhouses were being developed as her craft studio. I was glad. I preferred to see old properties evolve rather than collapse in on themselves to please the spiteful gnats. I'm going for a walk, I told Shadow, who raised his head momentarily to demonstrate that he was barely interested in the comings and goings of my life. I'm not sure where I'm going, but I'll take it for granted you'll know. And there'll be someone around to chop up the trees later. So there's no need to kill him. That was specific enough not to create a further loose contingency for death and mayhem. For a while at least. I didn't know where I was going as I walked up the track to the car. And that was something else that worried me. It made so many scary grinding and juddering noises these days, and remained a continual and harrowing reminder of my poverty. A few days earlier, when I'd been shopping for Nell and me at Aldi's, I turned on the ignition, and the engine block made an alarming rattling. It made the same noise when I stopped at Nell's cottage, and then at the top of the road. I bet it was the engine mountings, which if I left untreated, the engine would fall out. That's over 200 pounds I'd have to get hold of from somewhere. The problem being there was no somewhere. I wasn't going to ask Jenny. Ridiculous as it might sound, I'd have preferred to die of my poverty before ever asking her for money. If it weren't for the trouble and strife that Shadow was bringing into my life, I don't think I'd ever have bothered to get out of my bed many of those days. Anyway, the Parker Knoll in the woods in an autumnal landscape option had just been screwed up by bastard aliens. I stopped. I hadn't realized just how close I was to an edge, and to stepping over that edge. Is this how it was for people? That one extra small crisis could collapse all artifice, and all you were left with was a simple desire to be left in peace. Forever. I sat in the car girding my loins for the car's latest death rattle when I saw movement in the rearview mirror. 2 black cats hopped down from the hedge and looked over their shoulders in my direction for a full minute. Shit. They ambled down the track as if it were theirs and theirs alone. Oh, sod it. Crap's going to happen no matter what I do. Looking back, it was curious that seeing those two heading down toward Shadow somehow raised my spirits. I needn't worry about the engine falling out of the car, I thought, because at this rate the world would blow up long before that happened. I definitely felt buoyed up as I turned the ignition and the engine jumped with a massive clang. The death rattle of the idling car foresaw a disaster of some form or other. Despite the stress chemicals coursing through my veins, the car drove okay along flat roads if I kept the speed at no more than 50 miles per hour. Both braking and acceleration were hazardous for my fragile mental health. I chose to drive toward the setting sun because of the blue sky and sharp sunshine over Rosniga village, and dull despair coming from behind. I decided among myself that I fancied fish cake and chips, a can of Vimto, and a nice bench to sit on to overlook the sea. And maybe a sunset. Fish cake and chips with a can of Vimto is a blessed event to introduce into your life. It was still comparatively early in the year, but the village chippy in Rosniga should be open. I hoped. For some wibbly-wobbly reason, God, the universe, or whatever, everything gathered into a straight line in favor of my wishes being realized. The chippy was open, the chips were hot and tasty, the fish cake perfectly deep-fried, and the temperature of the drink bang on perfect. I don't have much salt in my diet, but with this meal I had a bit more than was healthy with the merest splash of vinegar. It would have been a period of rejoicing, had it not been a time for eating. I sat down at my favorite chip eating spot, the benches at the lower end of the village toward Broad Beach. And I felt my fragile soul embraced by the warmth from the sun. It was a warmth full of the promise of much more to come. I felt the attainment of a simple culinary ambition for the end of this day was surely a priming event for better. Maybe, just maybe, there would be a positive outcome after all. And, as far as I was concerned, it couldn't get any bloody worse anyway. Yeah, right. I should have known. When things were going well in my life, bad shit happened because I missed seeing something pretty bloody obvious. Hence the reason why all joy in my life was a transient delusion. Once again, unwarranted dodgy karma was heading my way. The primitive human in me likes to see the sun to its rest. Although I guessed it could manage without my help. But unfortunately, it would have to, because it was growing dark behind as the clouds from the south were catching up with me. I was heading home earlier than I had intended because I remained concerned about Shadow. The fact that the amigos had arrived couldn't have been a good sign for the rest of us. So I focused instead on the benefits any rain would bring to the natural processes in my readjusted garden. I usually drove straight back for the A55 expressway, because that was the easiest and quickest route home, but for some strange reason I decided against that normal habit. Ever since childhood, I'd enjoyed the island's back roads, well away from bimbling tourists and young dicks in cars too fast for them, and on their mother's insurance at that. Plenty of the little gits about who spend more on noisy exhaust units than the value of their cars. Apparently they were chick magnets and young Turks needed an audience. Therefore I was safe on the back roads in the middle of nowhere, where running over nervous hedgehog sheep and the odd bat was seen as a waste of vital and expensive petrol. So, at the village clock, I went right, rather than the usual left. It was the quickest route out of the village, and I turned right onto the coast road for Aberfrau. There, just before Aberfrau, I would turn left and go seriously cross-country. It was a route based on occult knowledge, but I was still heading toward the center of the island and home. I just turned onto the main road when I saw a stooped older man staring directly at me and waving his stick, farmer fashion. The waving was probably full of arcane agrarian code for tractor drivers about family fecundity, accountant rating and compass bearings. Of course, I was no tractor, but I stopped and lowered the passenger window to see what he wanted. Not a pretty sight. At least not the usual island spud face, and he certainly lacked that sad and gentle nobility of washy bark. His wiry hair was wild and abundant, fading to grey-brown at his temples. And his face was broad and deeply etched with vertical dark lines that spoke of experiences I didn't care to know about. He was dressed like an old farmer in uncared-for old boots, into which his baggy tweed trousers were firmly lodged. His long coat was open from the waist down and closed tight up to his neck. With farmers, clothing was no indication of wealth. You only saw that when they took their Mercs and Chelsea tractors to the agricultural show in August to show off to each other. At least he was clean-shaven, which I always took to mean he had a degree of dignity in his appearance, and had probably gone to chapel sometime or other. I couldn't judge him ill on that because I didn't make much of an effort in how I presented myself to the world. "Where you off to?" I asked, and saw something cunning I didn't fancy in his deep-set dark eyes. He didn't look like one of the "there's no money in farming" types. Therefore, he was a bit of a puzzle. But close up, I soon realized he wasn't a physically weak individual. Walking staff or not. It was growing darker, and although not forecast, I was sure torrential rain wasn't far behind. I wouldn't like to think of my father out here. Yet there was something furtive and calculating in those eyes, although not enough to make me put my foot down and leave him in my dust. He was an old farmer, I decided, and so I expected that he would try and rip me off somehow, or ask for money. Fat chance on the last one, I thought. I could ask you the same. The old man placed a massive murderer's hand on the top of the door and leaned on his stick to stare at me. He might be well shaved, but his natural fragrance was a little too natural for me, and there was a faint whiff of alcohol coming off him. "The other side of T. Croix," he answered me with a phlegmy voice that needed a damn good cough. Obviously best indulged elsewhere. And his accent was odd and unfamiliar. It sounded angular and his pronunciation of T. Croix was correct but odd. "Anything wrong?" he asked. I gambled the wrong way. It's a speciality of mine. I should definitely stick to the rule of depending on my instinct for a decision and then doing the exact opposite. I looked at him, and it made me think about myself and my age. Old age hits you suddenly. You're well on your way before you even realize it, trying to carry on with your old wicked and dipsomaniac ways, but your body no longer recovers. There's a fair number of single men I know, younger than me, who are only waiting in gentle despair for the inevitable. They spend their fading time on cheap alcohol and roll your own cigarettes. Washy Bark had been a far better man than any of them. And yet they would have ridiculed him. I comforted myself that I still had a bit of dignity left. And my Parker Knoll. If no longer my absent beautiful woodland. That was going to be a bit of a challenge. I didn't fancy being found by my bastard neighbor. He'd rifle the house and steal all the wood before phoning the police. Why couldn't life be more straightforward? "Hop in," I said stupidly. It took him a while to fold himself into the car. He was definitely a bigger man than I'd thought, and it looked and sounded like he had arthritis. His hands were really big and his nails cracked, talon-like and filthy. Washy lived in a time of dangerous drunk tramps. This one just smelled dangerous. I looked at his boots, black on grey by rain and age, and very old-fashioned. I wondered where on earth he'd got hold of them. "Jenny says that men like me were incapable of looking after ourselves because a good woman hadn't trained us. I don't think that anyone had ever trained this individual, except himself. University of life to be passed with extinction, and all that." "You keep looking at me," he said in a voice that rolled along a bed of rumbling phlegm. "You need to put on your safety belt." I pointed over his left shoulder. "I never wear them," he grunted, and waved an impatient finger at the windscreen for me to proceed. "It's me who the police'll fine," I advised him, looking directly into eyes that seemed only capable of constant challenge. "While you're in my car, I'm responsible for your safety, so put it on, please." It wasn't a request and was responded to with a grimace of resentment. "It's simple," I said. "No safety belt. No lift." I let him see that I was growing bored. He opened his mouth and revealed a foul and near barren wasteland of black teeth, mumbled some probably unholy epithets, and pulled the belt as if he didn't know how to click it in place. I did some appropriate pointing. Hell, I wasn't going to touch him. That done, I engaged the gears, dropped the handbrake, and we were off. From the corner of my eye, I caught him staring at me. "Anything the matter?" I asked without taking my eyes off the coast road. He shook his head and gazed searchingly at the road ahead. I remember wondering what was waiting for him on the other side of T. Croix. "I'll point when we get there," he said, as if he'd just read my thoughts. A friend once told me, "Speak ill of the devil, and the bastard'll steal your bike." Why was I thinking that? Yet there it was, front and center of my conscious mind. This man might look as if he were in his mid-70s, but no one in his sane mind would ever pick a fight with him. I'd take him wherever he wished, and then be glad to see him out of my car and on his way. He stank to high heaven, which enhanced his unique charm even further. I sought to engage him in conversation about where he came from, and whether he or his family were from the island. Unfortunately, all I received was some indecipherable grunts in response. And by the time we passed through the Cable Bay dip, the silence was uncomfortable. And the temperature dropped distinctly, even though it didn't look like immediate rain. I took the left turning just before Aberfrow and aimed inland, taking care to avoid the bunnies who were out in family groups. I chose to respect them and drive patiently. Unlike someone I knew who would chase them up the verges to crush them under his tires. Apparently that's fun. I frequently asked myself whether I could run over a bunny killer if the opportunity arose. The answer is that I could. And probably accrue green shield stamps and good karma for it. I bet even Shadow would give bunnies a head start. I shrugged away such a ludicrous thought. There's a steep camber to this road, and I felt it more than usual. When I looked at my passenger, I got the mad impression that he was bigger inside my car than he was outside. More than that, the stoop he'd exhibited waving me down was no longer apparent. And he was more than filling his side of my poor little car. I could only hope I didn't bounce on the center of the road. It becomes cold when someone tells you it is. But in the car with the heating on, it was still cold enough to give me goosebumps. I reached and adjusted the heat settings, and felt his shoulder touch mine. I pulled away rather too quickly and heard him chuckle. Some people just steal power wherever and however they can. Either this guy was developing an affection for me, and was leaning into me, or, more ridiculous, he was expanding. How about that? The cat wasn't here, but the weird shit certainly was. If you're in the middle of stuff, then you perceive it one component or event at a time. You reflect on it and amend or update it, until it evolves into understanding. Reasonably objectively, I observed that the temperature in the car was dropping, the guy seemed to be growing, and also worth noting is that the smell was growing worse. It wasn't just the smell of filth or body odor or dirty clothing, there was a stench to him of smoke. I stole a glance and found him looking directly back at me with a malign grin pasted across his grimy and deeply etched face. He lifted his chin in inquiry, and I turned away. I knew that I'd allowed a dangerous man to enter my car. I also knew the frail older man who'd waved me down with his stick wasn't the one sitting next to me. Breathing that had been labored and phlegm bubbled earlier, that I'd put down to a lifetime's smoking, was now a sharp rasp. I turned to him again and felt my heart skip an unpleasant beat. Why ever had I come this way? There was no reason at all for it. "I'm going to stop the car in a moment," I said, glad my voice didn't catch. I reached for the gear stick as I tapped the brakes and decelerated. A massive dirty murderous hand fell across my left hand. I turned to express my objection and regretted doing so. "Not yet," he rasped. In a voice that seemed to create its own delayed rumbling echo, which reminded me of the vicar that Nell and I had deposited in the Irish Sea. This was certainly new. I pulled my hand away, and held it against my chest, because the heat from his grasp was unbearable. If he hadn't intended for me to take my hand away, then he wouldn't have released it. I slammed a foot down on the footbrake and we jutted to a halt without the clutch, which I finally applied once I knew my hand hadn't been burned to painful crispiness. There wasn't a mark on it. Nothing. I stared at him. There was the familiar smile of the untrustworthy I recognized from my old job. I stared angrily through the windscreen. Mortal danger yet again. The universe really should give me a break. "I really think I'd prefer to stop," I said. The anger of being very pissed off helped me find my voice. And I was bloody cold again. "I'm cold and I'm going to fetch my coat. We can go on after that." I was doing my best to gather all variables together in search of an escape plan. I wouldn't stand a chance if this bastard turned on me in the car. I was alone in this isolated spot, far from houses and people in the middle of empty farmland. It would take him longer to get out of the car than it would me, even though I no longer believed the arthritis act he performed getting in. Nonetheless, no matter how much I loved my fragile blue Ford Focus, I would probably dump it at a second's notice if I had to, and head back for the coast road at a pace. Fine, he said. I could feel his voice through my boots and the car seat. I engaged the handbrake, switched off the ignition and removed the key. You won't need to do that. Safe habit, I said and held onto it. I got out of the car, went round to the back, and lifted the trunk, pretending to fetch a coat. Once I raised the rear shelf, I was in a blind spot. A quiet evening, he said. Coming round to the back of the car. I was shocked. How the hell had he just got out of the car without the suspension springing up and down? Yet there he was, ugly as anything, and taller and broader than when he'd entered my car. We're definitely out in shadow space here, I thought. He spoke softly and gently, his eyes missing out on the venture. Thinking of going for a walk? It's a quiet evening, I replied, flattening my emotions. No cat, therefore, as I suspected of shadow, this was a problem I was expected to deal with myself. So I took a bit of courage from that, and asked, just who are you? I threw the waterproof coat I was holding back in the boot. Me, he asked, looking somewhere specific in his mind. I'm no one. I repeat, I said, as I leaned against the raised boot cover and looked across at him. I felt a distinct fear but also found the resolve I'd recently grown accustomed to as a companion in crises. Who are you? And what do you want? He shrugged. I don't want anything much. He smiled and gave me a display of his rotten tombstones once again. I need to get from here to there. Simple. I think you'll have to walk from here on. I've got to turn back. I need to see someone. He leaned on the car, and that side sank a fair bit under his weight. Once you've taken me to my destination. He smiled a smile that must have been nurtured in a cold and faraway barren place and was arriving via remote control. I'm not taking you. I had to assert some authority. Otherwise, I'd lose all control of a situation over which I'd never been in control. Also, there was the simple fact that it was still my car about which we were talking. So I put on my game face. He pushed himself away from the car and up it came again. I scrutinized him and realized there was no way he would fit in my car. He was massive, well over 6 feet and as broad as he was tall. Of course you are. He placed his hand on the car roof and pressed down, and the car behaved accordingly. This was a display of casual threatening strength, but I had always been, well, recently, been wary of people whose first port of call was always to threaten violence. As soon as I closed the boot, the heavens opened up and there fell upon me torrential rain, unexpected rain. Very, very wet rain. Another bloody surprise was that the man had disappeared. I ducked down to look through the rear window. He was sat in the passenger seat, and experiencing the familiar problems with the safety belt. He turned his head and nodded down toward the driver's seat. What were the options? No matter how poorly the car drove, it was still my only means of communication with a world I barely understood. Sure as hell I wasn't going to allow some great big ape to steal it. It was a bit of a dilemma really, run, or be brave and protect my little car. I wasn't foolhardy then, and neither am I now. However, I did know that if this man, or whatever he was, if he had ill intent toward me, then there was very little I'd be able to do about it. I was also thinking about why there was never a sarcastic cat around when you really needed one. In the meantime, my passenger called out to me from his seat in the dry. I assure you that your circumstances will not improve until you get into shelter. I opened the door to the car but was reluctant to get in. The rain was beating a thunderous unholy tattoo on the car's roof, in synchrony with that dancing on the top of my head. My clothes began to shine with wetness, and it felt as if I was standing below a column of water dedicated to ensuring my misery. I knew it was undoubtedly related directly or indirectly to this man, or whatever he was. I leaned down and looked at him, sitting unfeasibly comfortable in my car, which surely had to violate this universe's laws. This person seemed determined to compound my recent loss of confidence in physics. Terrible weather. He smiled, and pointed at me. I surrendered to my discomfort. Either I stood there soaked to the skin, or I got back in the car to sit next to whatever it was. I got in, and yuck. There can't be many things worse than the world highlighting in drag how miserable your situation is. I pulled my safety belt across and clicked it in place, which my passenger found edifying and subsequently did the same. Do you really need a safety belt? I asked. Why pretend? I knew that he knew I knew. Not really, he answered, with a reasonable smile for a change. But reasonable or not, we wouldn't be holding hands in the shower anytime soon. I'm just blending in, he said. I stared at a windscreen impenetrable to vision, shrugged and turned the key to start the engine. I flicked the switch for the windscreen wipers all the way to top speed, but it made little difference. They'd have been better employed on a submarine. I was really pissed off. I gripped the steering wheel in the correct position of 10-2, and then turned to him. And that anger and frustration were displacing my fear. Right. Who's taking who where? Which is it? His eyebrows were grey and bushy with an age that belied his vitality and obvious physical strength. I stared directly into his deep-set eyes and waited. He replied. Life is full of dilemmas and consequences. What the hell is that supposed to mean when it's home? He twisted as he leaned forward, placed his left hand on my left shoulder and gave it what he might regard as an admonitory squeeze that hurt like hell. Be careful with your temper, he advised me. Bollocks to that, I spat back at him. You're the one who needs me right now. And it's not the other way around. You're strange. He was intrigued and pulled his hand away. I'd normally expect someone to be terrified by now. But you're just angry. I really was pissed off, because I took it for granted that they were all in it together. Whoever they all were, and whatever it all was. But in the meantime there was me, feek and weeble human numero uno, and utterly pissed off. Stop the rain. I tapped the steering wheel impatiently and added, and the smell. We don't need that either. This strange man held up his hand in an unnecessary gesture, and the rain stopped. Further, the stench that had been our hideous companion all along faded away. But it wasn't replaced by a pleasant fragrance. Alcohol and the bouquet of sour sweat and God knows what, asserted their presence. Magic, yes. I offered him a quick sarcastic smile, and held his gaze long and hard, giving back as good as I received. I realized that his face reflected life experience more than age. His facial bone structure was heavy and dark, graying hair was as coarse as a horse's tail. And his pallor suggested that he was a general stranger to sunshine. But the eyes though, the eyes were black pits that invited inward inquiry into a fathomless and pretty frightening place. Physically, there were no similarities between him and anyone, or anything I'd ever met. But there was his essence. Something that seemed very familiar by now. Had anyone been passing along this godforsaken road, we'd have looked like a pretty odd couple. Well, maybe not so pretty. This was no brewing bromance, and I wondered how long it would be before he lost his temper with my anger. Best keep him off balance. So I asked, why can't you make your own way to where you want to go? If I'd known it was you, I'd never have come this way. What? You know me? I frowned and took a figurative step back. I meant it when I said I wanted to be invisible. I especially didn't want anyone else of Shadow's strangeness to know about me. He shook his head. Never seen you before, but it's the fact that you're a human I find surprising. And why is that? It seemed an appropriate puzzled response. It just is. He rubbed his side window with the back of a massive hand. Two people's breathing had set up the condensation. But it seemed only one of them was human. Humans are generally useful because they choose to be blind to anything challenging their simple minds. I can't disagree with you on that one. I sat back in my seat and then leaned forward quickly as my back felt the cold wetness of my clothes. It wasn't a good day, was it? The earlier joy from the fish cake and chips, plus Vimto, had been lost a few miles back, and now I was just wet, miserable, pissed off, and wanted to be home. It appears that we have an unexpected change of dynamic here, he was honest enough to admit, as our mutual inspections continued. I had to admire him for his admission. Why deny the bleedin' obvious, I suppose? I'm sure this was how Shadow thought. Again I said, why can't you go where it is you want to, if you're anything like I think you are? He opened his mouth to say something. And then he closed it. As if he'd changed his mind. One thing I did notice is that his teeth were now white and complete. I'm sure I've said it somewhere else, but I'm no longer surprised by anything much these days. He had yet to give me an answer though. Instead, he grabbed me painfully around my throat with his left hand, his skin hot and dry. But he didn't squeeze. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't squeeze the life out of you? I brought both hands to his and was surprised at his strength. You need to go from here to somewhere else. And I think you've got a couple of problems before you even get to me, I said. And pulled at the hands. And what are those problems? He smelled smoky now, and just as repugnant as before. But at least he withdrew his hands. It seemed that he'd now adopted my stance of being frustrated and angry. 1. I advised him. You can't drive. 2. There's something ahead that you want to get past, and 3. It's your bad luck you chose me. He turned to face forward and rumbled something incoherent to himself. I gathered he agreed with me about choosing the wrong car. He turned suddenly and his hand was at my throat again. Yet there was no resistance when I pulled and pushed it down and away. I removed the key from the ignition and dropped it in his open hand. Threats don't really work with me. It was pretty clear that I wasn't the only one having a crappy day. Hardly any humans know about us, he said unexpectedly as he stared at the set of keys. We've always been careful about that. But your assessment's correct, but I want to know how you know. He held out the keys to me between murderous thumb and forefinger. His eyes were suddenly wide in realization. You know one of us. I took the keys and thought of the cat, mental versus physical strength. It would be an interesting combat. I reckon I've got a little friend who could beat the crap out of you, for all your size and drama. Okay, tell me. And I'll see if I can help. Perhaps, instead of being braver, the cat had made me smarter, and accidentally taught me to look beyond all the fantastic crap I'd seen with him. My passenger continued with his intense silence. There was probably something stronger than shadow out there, but right now, it didn't live in this parish, not even visiting. A presence has touched you, said my passenger quietly and thoughtfully. Touched? I wouldn't say touched. Had my life messed up more than anything. He raised his chin in understanding. Most people run when I turn up. I can understand that. He took a sharp in-breath and looked at me contemplatively for a moment before speaking. I need to travel across a dark point, he said. Whatever a dark point is, I thought. Which is where I come in. He nodded. I hate people who play games, I told him. He nodded again. All civilizations appear to have locations famous for reluctant spirits of the dead. Ghosts, as you call them. And that's because it's true. It's exactly what they are. That sounded interesting. He continued. These are locations imbued by some long-forgotten appalling act or tragedy, maybe thousands of years old, and they've become fixed points in spaces and times. And there's one ahead? He nodded. Is this what Shadow was on about, I wondered? Was his friend Washibark the Tramp also one of these odd travelers? It's not the only one around here, is it? He turned and looked at me, puzzled that a human could even be aware of this shit. No, it's not. So how do you know about this? I might as well fess up. You know a cat? That brought him up short. His eyes narrowed, and he stared at me warily. A feline. Describe him. Interesting. Him. Not it. Black, shiny, a little white shield on his chest. I raised my eyebrows inquisitively. Does he happen to be a callous little bastard? I've seen no evidence that says he isn't, I replied. I wondered if my bona fides had been established by admitting to that association. You keep watching that little bastard. You can't trust him further than you can throw him. I gave a non-committal bob of my head. Tell me more about the dark point. It's like we were partners all of a sudden, an unlikely pair at that. It's not that complicated. Like I said, something bad happened in one spot, sometimes recent and sometimes beyond any culture's memory. He dropped his shoulders and seemed to relax into the tale. Some spirits or ghosts tend to be as cowardly in death as they were alive, so they tend to be too scared to let go of their old world. They're somehow drawn to these specific places because it makes them feel secure, which I've always found odd. Raindrops began to fall heavily on the windscreen and roof again. My passenger held up a hand. Nothing to do with me. It's just weather. Weather report said it wasn't supposed to rain, I said. He smiled. It doesn't matter where you go, they never get the weather right. The dynamic had certainly changed. Although he was still dangerous. An association with a certain callous little bastard kept me safe. How, I don't know, but there seemed to be a little bit of respect, if not outright fear, being directed toward Shadow. I wondered if it would be the same wherever I went and whoever I met. I looked at the changed person next to me. Maybe the things that united us are just ordinary things. Like complaints about the weather, nasty bosses, ugly in-laws, fantasizing about winning the lottery, and a universal dislike of callous little bastards. You were saying about ghosts, spirits, I said. He yawned and looked as if he could do with a good sleep. Most ghosts don't even notice humans because they're so preoccupied with their own circumstances that they ignore what's happening around them. Aren't we supposed to move on or something? My question seemed to trouble him, and he waved his hands about in an expression of confusion or lack of knowledge. I didn't know which. It depends. None of it's as straightforward as the stories you humans tell each other. The thing about ghosts and dark points is that they become so bloody invested in a particular place, without knowing why, other than they're attracted there, that they consciously don't remember that there's a way out. So, a ghost conscious. He wiggled his hand again to indicate uncertainty and continued, they're only conscious of themselves really. Or anyone competing with them in their misery. But the thing is, and it's a real bloody nuisance, is that they collectively respond to certain energies. They don't know why, but they're drawn to anything with a particular energy. Travelers like me. Creatures not nailed to that spot. Like shit to a blanket, as you humans are fond of saying. He gave me a moment to make sense of what he was saying. It had crossed my mind that you might be a ghost yourself, I said. I take it you're not. Do you bloody mind? He was insulted by the very thought. Nothing of the bloody sort. I'm a traveler and I move between places along highways and junctions and crossroads nailed in space and time, where bloody human ghosts tend to gather. And they're a near universal bloody nuisance. People say that the devil hangs around crossroads waiting to make deals, I said. The devil? He slung his head back and laughed. That is one overrated bastard and self-publicist. You humans have such an overactive imagination, you know? Barely improves when you're dead, by the way. I let the insult slide, and asked him why the hell he wanted my car. Apparently, the reason was embarrassing. Embarrassing? We're not all as tricky as your cat friend, you know. Most of us only want to move quietly from one place to another for business. Like any path, he said, they become well worn with their hills and hollows, in energy terms that is. But on the other hand, some spots are dead easy to move through these days because we had enough of the blockages and we began throwing the bastard things through the void. He seemed disgusted by something that slipped across his mind. Some idiots wanted to offer them pre-transitional counseling? Bugger it, we thought. We just threw them through. We haven't got time to indulge some idiot ghosts. Being stupid in life and being dead doesn't make humans any smarter. Work to treat and very satisfying to clear the road, as it were. But obviously not here. I was intrigued. This planet's bad enough, he said. But this island? This island is a regular ghostly shithole. I just wished he didn't keep saying nasty things about my home island. I don't think I've ever heard any stories of ghosts on this road, I said. Well, there wouldn't be. You're confusing me now, I said. You shrinking? It looked like he was shrinking. Still big though. Probably. He was distracted from the point he was making. Happens when I lose concentration. Like I said, there seem to be more and more idiots gathering about the dark points on this bloody island than anywhere else I've ever known. It's like this place is attracting anyone from anywhere. He shook his head in disgust. Another thing. Someone I knew was stuck here for ages a while back. The locals just clung to her day and night. She could have starved to death. The road from here to T. Croix was as dull a route as any. I couldn't imagine someone like Shadow, or even this person, bothering to come this way. Just beyond T. Croix was Pencarnashog and Bryn D. Apart from the defunct Queen's Pub, the best pub this side of anywhere, there was nothing in either place. It was a great pub, wasn't it, he said. Hoy! Get out of my head, I barked at him. Sorry. I just knew what you were thinking. I used to stop there and talk to the old lady. This was a queer transition from the threats and intimidation of a handful of minutes ago. So where does the route take you after that? He tapped his nose, which was plainly a universal gesture among all species that possessed a nose. Can't tell you. Need to know, I asked. It had stopped raining again. I pointed out the windscreen. None of my doing. I told you your island was bloody odd. He'd now settled comfortably in the car. Need to know? No. Just none of your business. Can you switch the engine on, please? It's cold in here. So much for a macho entity, I said. Given a preference, I always opt for warm over cold. What about you? You make a valid point. And Shadow comes this way? Who? Shadow, I said. The cat. He slapped his knees and the car rocked from side to side as he roared with laughter. Shadow. That's priceless. Wait till the guys hear about this. Sorry. He stopped laughing but carried on indulging in the odd titter. I couldn't imagine Shadow having the same troubles. Being a tricky little bastard, guaranteed he'd found countless shortcuts and bypasses all over the place. Always leaves a mess wherever he goes, I hear. He gets called in and havoc is usually close on his tail. The engineers have a dedicated team that follows him about. Engineers? Forget I said that. He turned to me while adjusting the heating to the maximum. If I were you, I wouldn't admit to anyone that you know him. Could be bad for your reputation. He might have had a point. I wondered whether the two other shadows were engineers. How I was going to broach that subject with Shadow and get an answer were tasks best left for now. So explain to me why you need my help. You've got a car. It acts like what you humans call a Faraday cage, which more or less keeps me invisible. They see a human in a car and ignore you because you're a human, a live human. They tend to hate living humans and don't interact because the energy of the dark point is far more attractive. Persons like me have been traveling this way for hundreds of years, he continued. And almost always getting into trouble on this godforsaken island. The best thing for us was when you humans invented metal cars. The frame hides our potential energy long enough to pass by. So how did your friend escape? Simple. She pouted one way and ran the other. Human ghosts are so thick, but you've got to choose the right moment. Okay. Tell me what you want me to do. It became clear that all I had to do was drive to T. Croy's and hope that the car was enough of a disguise for him and his energy. Question, I said. Yes, he asked impatiently. If I don't ask, I don't learn, I said. So, do you reckon there'll be a concentration of daft ghosts, confused, traumatized, or in denial down the road? May have been there for centuries? Probably longer. And too many to throw through the void, as you put it. Far too many. Bloody weird place you've got here. So you keep saying. Because it's true. Nice and warm in here now. Shame you're not dry, isn't it? He cackled. Lovely how the mind can switch attention away from pain and discomfort. The discomfort comes crashing back down on you. I was wet again and far colder than the car's heater would cure. I just drive and stop for nothing? Exactly. He looked tense. If there's a tractor? That would make things a little awkward. I'm in a bit of a hurry, things to do here while I still can. Important things. I'm surprised that your friend Shadow, he still found that amusing, isn't on his way as well. Really? Weird stuff's been happening. And it's not going to be good for any of you. No shit. Tell me about it. He let out a long breath. You'll be surprised to hear that there are rules. He shook his head as if in disagreement with them. So I can't tell you. Sorry. I'm unsure whether to tell you to stay close to the cat or run as far away from him as you can. He was troubled and seemed to be in a dilemma about whether he should tell me or not. It was something best approached sideways. Out of interest, I said, why the alcohol? Technical shit. The booze? No. It's the only way to travel across this crappy little planet of yours. Anesthetic for the soul. I pointed toward my poor car's engine and said, I'd better warn you though, this car's not well. This bullying giant parked in the seat next to me? It looked as if the news nearly broke his nerve. I sensed an immediate panic in his voice. You're not telling me it's going to break down, are you? I offered him an encouraging smile. A futile hope is better than no hope at all, I said. While you're here, tell me, are there any more like the cat and you around here? At a time like this? Plenty. Now can we get moving, please? I just want to get me off this bloody horrible planet of yours as soon as I can. Charming. Trust me, he replied tartly. You need to have a good look at yourselves from outside. Not very attractive, I assure you. Both alive and dead, humans are grossly stupid. He looked at me suddenly and stopped digging. On the whole, that is. He said to the sound of some rapid backpedaling. That way, he pointed forward. Please. Nasty ghosts? I sought confirmation. Plenty of the bastards. Before we get going, I said. He slapped his legs in frustration. Enough. I was beginning to think maybe I could monetize his fear in some way. Better not though. I repeated, before we get going. I was thinking about the nothings and all the other stuff going on around my home. Don't push it, kid. I explained briefly. Any more of that stuff around here? It's a new thing, he said. It's odd. Like they're on tour or something. Hardly enough for an incursion at the moment. But I hear there's a lot of them about. And you never know where they are, until you smell the bastard things right on top of you. He paused for a few seconds and stared at me with surprising concern. It's not going to be good for you here, he said. Also, and nothing personal, your ghosts smell bloody awful, by the way. Coming from you, that means nothing, I jabbed back at him. Just drive ahead and try not to be upset by anything you see. And whatever you do. I finished his sentence for him. Don't stop. And added. I just might. I'm sure there must have been happier looking monsters somewhere in the world right then. Worth knowing. T-Croix is a state of mind more than anything else you'll ever come across on the island. Actually, that's not quite true. It sort of sums up the entire place really. It's a swift rattle across the railway lines, and then a dip down into Brindisi, before you decide where the momentum of your despair will take you next. During our little drive, for those with eyes of a particularly odd type, the car had looked like something that might have inhabited a post-apocalyptic zombie movie. It was probably something to do with an energy threshold that my passenger, the traveler, brought with him. The point my passenger had wanted to get past was quite obvious when you started looking for it. Compared to what I'd been seeing for the past few months, there was nothing special there. Other than, I had to chase two reluctantly dead former county councillors out of the car once we were past. I was pleased to note they were still dead and still incompetent and incoherent. Somehow they managed to look uglier in death than they did in life. Just how the hell they'd got in the car was a surprise to me. And a cause of obvious panic for my passenger. When they left us, they waded knee-deep through the tarmac to the Ghost of the Queen's pub, where a crowd of spectres had gathered, attracted by a futile belief in some impossible event. The Queen's was never going to open again. The queue reminded me of a bus stop sign they had inside my mum's dementia ward, where patients would gather, believing they could go home. They would be gently distracted away for lunch, tea and supper before returning to wait patiently for a bus that would never come. The journey was a corruption of a scene from an Eagles song. But as I said, I'd already seen too much to be too surprised by any of it. As requested by my strange passenger, I stopped outside the large chapel on the hill to let him out. I was about to shout something after him about the incursions, but the bastard had disappeared in the few seconds I'd looked away. What the hell was going on? Something was going to happen according to the traveler. Something big. And something not at all nice. But of course I knew that. I knew it without really knowing it. And I was alone among humans. It seemed that everyone in the know was finishing off their business before scarpering and leaving the planet at the same time. Humans were still busy watching soap operas and in intense discussions about bugger all. You really had to laugh at our gross stupidity, didn't you? When I got home, I parked the car at the top and strolled damply down to the cottage, preoccupied and with a worried look on my face. Shadow was seated on his now favorite picnic table and looked pretty well considering how he'd been those last few days. He had that tricky look about him, a sense of knowledge, either true or just tricky. "We need to talk," I said. He raised his little chin in his distinctive disinterested way.